Welcome to the National Institute of Health and Care Research Mentoring Programme. This is one of a number of recorded professional development webinars. And in this webinar, we're going to focus on reflective practice in the context of mentoring. So the agenda for this session recording is to explore reflective practice, specifically in the context of mentoring, to present to you a number of reflective questions that you can take away and think about in the context of your mentoring practice. I'm also going to signpost an additional topic guide and some key resources. My name is Julie Haddock-Millar. I'm one of the facilitators of the mentoring programme. I focus specifically on the continuing professional development and the evaluation of the programme. I'd like to start with looking at what is reflective practice. Now, we know that people learn all the time, but most of our learning happens without conscience, or often we might say unconsciously. And reflective practice is a way of recognising and articulating what we're learning on a moment-by-moment basis. Now, we can distinguish three terms in relation to reflective practice: reflection, thinking about something that's happened or might have happened without any specific purpose. Reflective practice, thinking about experiences in a purposeful way, capturing the learnings that we can use it. And reflexivity, thinking about how we reflect. Often these are referred to as levels of reflection. But it's also referred to as a practice. It can be a skill, a process, or a system. And I wanted to explain these different terminologies that you might read about when looking, for example, at some of the key resources. There's a really useful distinction that's been made. So reflective practice might be how we reflect upon an experience and the way we and others reacted to it. Reflection as a skill, how we review and reconstruct our experiences to better understand them. As a process, focusing on the issue, reconstructing it and learning from it. A system, how we bring existing knowledge and expertise to bear, either to reflect on our own issues or to help another person reflect on theirs. So a variety of different ways of thinking about reflection. Now, a very helpful framework that's been created by Professor David Clutterbuck and colleagues is referred to originally as the 7 conversations of coaching, but I've adapted this for the 7 conversations of mentoring. And there are 7 phases in this model for both mentors and mentees to think about really the art of reflection in the context of their mentoring practice. We can see the 7 phases or the 7 conversations on this slide. And what I'm going to do is to talk you through each one, and you can perhaps reflect on how you might be engaging with each of these conversations. Now, the first refers to the mentor's inner dialogue. Now, the purpose of this dialogue is to ensure that the mentor is fully prepared for the mentoring conversation. The quality of the conversation is dependent to a significant extent on the quality of thinking both mentor and mentee put into their preparation. Although obviously we still want spontaneity in the context of mentoring relationships. So this is the dialogue prior to the mentoring session. Then we've got the mentee's initial inner dialogue, again, prior to the mentoring session. And ideally, what we would suggest is that for any mentoring session, both the mentee and the mentor would want to prepare for that naturally. And so, for example, for the mentee, you might want to allow at least 30 minutes to an hour of quality reflective space prior to a mentoring session to get the most out of it, to prepare fully. The mentor-mentee spoken conversation, this often attracts the most amount of attention, and often it's the easiest conversation because it's the conversation during the mentoring session that's taking place. Sometimes we're often oblivious to what's happening internally and that inner conversation. We're more focused on the spoken conversation. So what are we actually saying? How are we behaving within the mentoring session itself? And so reflecting on that obviously can be helpful. And of course, there's also, as a mentor, there's also the mentor's inner dialogue during the spoken conversation. And you might have experienced this yourself, where occasionally there can be a parallel conversation where, for example, a mentee might have spoken about a particular theme, a particular experience, which really resonates with the mentor. The mentor finds themselves having drifted off for a moment, thinking about a prior experience, for example. So in some ways, it's like a running commentary advanced drivers use when we talk ourselves through how we observe the road ahead, that inner conversation, perhaps. And then for the mentee during the spoken conversation, so the mentee also being aware of what's happening internally. Are there parallel conversations that are happening? And so again, just enhancing that awareness around that, not just the spoken conversation, but the inner conversation that's happening during the mentoring conversation. Now, subsequent to the meeting, we can reflect on what was happening in the meeting, so reflection on action, and it's often a critical part of our continuous improvement and personal growth. So whilst it's fresh in our memory, we might want to record the reflections just immediately following the mentoring session. Sometimes you may want to, as mentor and mentee, capture a summary of the mentoring conversation in, for example, that 1 hour window, if that's the time you've allocated for the mentoring session. And also for the mentee, that post-meeting reflection. So translating our thoughts into, for example, practical actions, perhaps a next step, something we might do as a consequence of the mentoring meeting. Now, what's very helpful is Professor David Clutterbuck and colleagues have put together a number of example questions which align to each of these 7 conversations in coaching and mentoring. I've extracted some of the questions and I provided them here. And so you can read these and see whether some of them might be relevant when you're engaging with each of the conversations and talking those through. Now, a key theme that is often associated with reflection and reflective practice is presence. And you may have read and seen a lot about this, particularly over the last 2 or 3 years. It's become quite heightened. And we see a lot of textbooks on coaching and mentoring that do talk about presence as a key characteristic of effective developmental relationships. Now, normally, when people talk about presence, they mean the way people naturally command attention and respect. So that's one interpretation, which is often referred to as a leadership competence. But in coaching and mentoring, presence has a different meaning. It refers to the quality of being fully attentive to and with the other person in that relationship. So different to presence as a leadership competence. Now you can find opportunities to practice both within coaching and mentoring conversations and in other situations, but also when you're alone or when you're in meetings, there might be opportunities to practice that. So for example, in group meetings, do we find ourselves drifting off, for example, and how can we bring ourselves back into the room, metaphorically in that sense, physically as well? And some practical guidelines when trying to enhance and improve our presence. So the first would be to slow down. So sometimes reducing the pace of the conversation, and Professor David Clutterbuck suggests by at least half. Perhaps taking pauses before you respond to another person. Now, improvements come from learning to listen, to yourself listening. So that's an interesting concept, I think, learning to listen to yourself listening. So we can expand this, the awareness of how present you might be as a mentor or a mentee. So for example, as a mentor, you might offer the mentee opportunities to pause and reflect. You might help mentee build their presence by asking them from time to time, what's going on for you in this moment? You might be and show curiosity about what's happening in the mentee's inner world as the mentee speaks, for example. And of course, this applies equally both to mentors and mentees. So what next? So reflecting on this content, you might want to think about what reflective questions can you, as a mentor and your mentee, ask yourselves in preparation for the first session. What actions can you take as a mentor or a mentee to ensure that you're building and reflecting, so building reflection into the mentoring session, so during the session? And as a mentor and a mentee, what reflective questions can you ask yourself after the mentoring session that can capture new insights and learning, for example? Now, as I mentioned, there is an online topic guide that accompanies this session, in addition to a number of references here that are also captured in the online topic guide if you want to read further on the topic of reflection. Now, as you'll be aware, there is a dedicated programme team within the National Institute of Health and Care Research for the mentoring programme. I provided the email here where you're able to contact the team should you have any questions at all about the mentoring session. Thanks so much for listening to this recording.